What wedding moment made you realize this marriage won't last? Story 1. My husband was the best man at a wedding where the bride was an absolute nightmare, not just during the wedding, but in everyday life. None of the groom's friends could stand her, and she didn't seem to have any friends of her own. We knew the marriage was doomed when, during the wedding portraits, she was making everyone miserable. The groom, clearly exhausted, sighed and said, "I'll just send her to therapy, and if that doesn't work, we can just get divorced." Story 2. I used to work at an event center that hosted a lot of weddings. After one ceremony, I saw the groom slap a bridesmaid's butt in the hallway. She just laughed, and with a big smile said, "Oh, Jeremy, you'll never change." Story 3. I was the maid of honor at my friend's wedding. They had been together for nearly 10 years, and everyone thought they were the perfect couple. The wedding was big, expensive, and beautiful. My friend would have been happy with a small event, but the groom insisted on a large wedding because of his big family. That seemed reasonable until the day of the wedding. Sitting in the front row with her parents, I realized the guest balance was completely off. The groom had 3 best men, several ushers, and his sister and a best man did readings during the ceremony. At dinner, all 3 best men gave long speeches about him. The photographer was even a friend of his mom, so she kept pulling the groom and his groomsmen away for hilarious photos, leaving the bride sidelined. Throughout the day, it felt like she was just there to look good while he had his event. By the reception, he was drunk, spilled a drink on her wedding dress, and spent the night dancing with his friends. It felt more like a birthday party than a wedding. 3 months later, he became emotionally abusive. A month after that, he admitted he had been having an affair for years, and then he left. If I hadn't witnessed his behavior at the wedding, I never would have guessed he was capable of that. 4 years later, my friend still hasn't been able to trust or date again, but she has completely transformed her life. She's traveled the world solo, retrained for a new career, and become an incredibly brave, independent woman. When he left, she cut him out completely, blocked mutual friends, disappeared from his world. She made sure he'd always wonder if he had made the right choice, while she never looked back. I know she'll find real love one day, and I truly hope his dying thought is about her. Story 4. A buddy of mine got married almost 30 years ago. Before the wedding, his fiancée told him at least 10 times, if he smashed cake in her face, it was over. Day of the wedding, his friends started teasing him, making whip sounds, saying he had to prove who wore the pants. She fed him her piece of cake. He mashed hers into her face. She walked out and got the marriage annulled. Story 5. I hate the cake smash tradition and firmly told my fiancé that under no circumstances should he smash cake in my face. He didn't. Instead, he took a tiny bit of icing on his pinky finger, lightly dabbed it on the tip of my nose, and then kissed it off. It was cute, made for some great photos, and we've been happily married for nearly a decade. Story 6. At my brother's wedding, the maid of honor used her toast to profess her love for him, right in front of everyone. Her husband got up, walked to the head table, picked her up, and carried her away before she could embarrass him any further. They lasted about 3 months. Meanwhile, my brother and his wife are still happily married 20 years later. Story 7. The bride's dad was an actual gangster, a genuinely scary guy, and he treated the groom like garbage. He constantly made comments about how the groom only had one kidney, mocking him every chance he got. The worst part, the bride never stood up for her husband. She just laughed along. They are now divorced. Story 8. I was the maid of honor. After the ceremony, the bride, groom, best man, and I went into a private room to sign the marriage certificate. The bride excused herself to use the bathroom. The moment she left, the groom turned to the officiant and started making really mean remarks about her cooking, something she was incredibly passionate about. A few minutes later, she came back, overheard them talking about cooking, and beamed at him, assuming he had been praising her. He just scoffed awkwardly and changed the subject. That moment always stuck with me. He wasn't laughing with her, he was laughing at her, behind her back. They lasted 7 months. Story 9. My wife is an event planner, specializing in high-end weddings. Think $150K and up just for the reception. One of the wildest stories she told me? On the morning of the wedding, while getting their hair and makeup done, the bride and her mother were still negotiating the terms of the prenup. There was a clause where, after 1 year, the financial terms would ease up, allowing the bride to walk away with a hefty payout. Story 10. The groom started his wedding speech with, "We all know I didn't want to get married, but we're here for the bride and the child we had together." They lasted exactly 1 year and 3 months. Story 11. Portuguese wedding. A fistfight broke out at the head table during the reception between 2 groomsmen. Why? They were arguing over who had slept with the bride first. The groom had no clue. 2 years later, he came home early from work and caught her in bed with another man. I was honestly surprised it took that long, but on the bright side, the midnight buffet was amazing. Story 12. The groom got into a fist fight with the bride's father. They split after 4 months. Both families had serious drinking problems. The father-in-law had always hated the groom, and while I wasn't there for what set it off, I do know it ended with the bride getting elbowed in the eye as she tried to break it up. The happy couple left the wedding early. This was in rural Canada. Not Letterkenny, but basically Letterkenny. I'd say the father-in-law won the fight, though. Story 13. I used to work at a museum that doubled as a wedding venue in the summers. Part of the wedding package included after-hours access for guests, so my job was basically just to greet people and keep an eye on things. One wedding got wild. Nearly everyone was drunk. People were jumping into the fountain. Someone threw up in the fountain. At one point, the bride was in tears. Turns out the groom and one of his groomsmen had snuck upstairs to a bathroom together. When the bride's father found out, a massive fight broke out between him and the groom. It got so bad that the cops had to be called. It was highly entertaining for me, but I felt terrible for the bride. Story 14. I'm a wedding videographer, and my favorite moment? I was seated at the table with all the random guests, including the groom's ex. After a few drinks, she leaned over and casually admitted that she had slept with the groom just a few months before the wedding. Story 15. I was a +1 at a wedding where I didn't know anyone but my date. At one point, the bride sat down at our table, completely drunk, and started talking. Then she blurted out that she had just slept with her ex, right before walking down the aisle, like in her wedding dress in the bridal suite. Then she finished my drink and wobbled off to the dance floor. I was speechless. They were divorced in less than a year. Story 16. This wasn't exactly a wedding moment, but more of a reception moment. The couple had already gotten married on some tropical island, but since most of their friends and family couldn't attend, they decided to throw an extravagant party when they got back. They spent a ridiculous amount of money on what ended up being one of the tackiest celebrations I've ever seen. Picture renting out an elementary school cafeteria, then hiring someone with questionable taste to decorate it. They booked an expensive caterer, but only served food you'd find at a low-end county fair, because, according to them, nobody likes fancy crap. Then they hired a DJ whose idea of a first dance song was Freaks of the Industry by Digital Underground. And no, that part isn't an exaggeration. At first I thought, well, different people have different tastes. If they're happy, that's what matters. But then, just before the money dance, a tradition I had never heard of until that night, I overheard some interesting gossip. Apparently, the couple had already fought about the cost of the reception. The bride thought the whole thing was a disaster, while the groom was convinced it was classy as hell. So convinced, in fact, that he used his new wife's credit card to pay for everything without telling her. She had been furious when she found out and even kicked him out for a while. He ended up staying with an ex, and there were rumors something had happened between them. No one knew the full details, but the bride eventually forgave him. The real kicker, the money dance was supposedly meant to help them recover financially from the reception, with the hope that they'd collect at least $30,000 in a few minutes. As I watched people pin cash onto them, I did some mental math and thought, yeah, this isn't going to last. Story 17. A friend's wedding back in 2016, nice enough for a group of early 20-somethings. I was a bridesmaid and didn't know the groom well, but he seemed like a quiet, decent guy. The day before the wedding, the bride, who had been my friend for years, asked me to help babysit one of the groomsmen. Apparently, he was a nightmare. She asked me, another bridesmaid, the DJ, and others to cut him off from alcohol, keep him from making a speech, and stop him from hitting on women. This guy had 6 kids, 2 DUIs, and a reputation for being a drunken mess, but he was the groom's best friend. On the wedding day, things went south fast. The guy broke into the bar, got hammered, had to be dragged down the aisle, got the florist drunk, and the two of them pretty much fell asleep in the middle of the dance floor. Then, during the father-daughter dance, he decided to make what I can only assume was meant to be a speech. The bride was furious and overwhelmed, trying to keep things from turning into a complete disaster. Meanwhile, the groom kept blocking our attempts to keep his friend in check, insisting we just let it go, even though he was doing everything the bride had explicitly asked him not to do. It felt like self-sabotage. Later in the night, the guy broke into the groom's stash of homemade mead, something he had made specifically for the wedding. Then he stripped down and ran through the parking lot, hiding in bushes at 11 p.m. As if the night wasn't chaotic enough, the bride and groom texted me later, asking if I'd be interested in being their third in an open relationship. I found out later that this was mostly the groom's idea. The bride had agreed to an open relationship only under the condition that he'd marry her. mainly because she needed medical benefits. They divorced a year and a half later. Story 18. After a wedding, my friend's new wife, who was usually quiet in public, started screaming at his family. Right there at the reception, she told them this would be the last time they'd ever see them and how awful they all were. It was brutal to watch. 2 years later, my friend walked in on her with another guy. Story 19. At my cousin's wedding, she and her husband said, "I semi-promise" in their vows. No idea what that was supposed to mean. Maybe a polite way of saying, "I'll try, but if it gets too hard, I'm out." Strangely enough, they've been married for over 30 years now. Story 20. At the wedding reception, the entire bridal party, including both sets of parents, started a betting pool on how long the marriage would last. The best man won, nailing it at 14 months. Story 21. The bride had a full-blown panic attack while getting ready, convinced the groom wasn't going to show. She kept saying he didn't really want to get married again, but felt like it was too late to back out. They were both barely 21, and this was already his second marriage. They had gotten engaged just 6 weeks after meeting, only waiting that long because his divorce wasn't finalized yet. He did show up, but only after downing several shots to work up the courage. By 11 a.m., he was completely wasted. They separated after a year, but right around that time, she found out she was pregnant. They got back together for the baby, but ended up divorcing when the child was 2. Within a month, she and their kid had moved in with a new guy, someone she had only known for 3 weeks. Story 22. I used to work at a nice restaurant in New Orleans. The bride was lovely, excited, polite, and happy to work within their budget. The groom, on the other hand, was an insufferable know-it-all, constantly trying to bargain. "Crab cakes don't cost that much. What if I buy them myself and you just serve them?" That kind of thing. On their wedding day, I was holding the door for them as they walked out for the first time as husband and wife. The bride beamed and said, "We got married. I'm so happy." The groom, "Not really. We still have to fill out paperwork and file it with the state. I've seen deflated balloons with more life than that poor woman. I really hope she got out of there." Story 23. This happened at a bachelorette party. The bride had been having an affair, and everyone knew about it. The groom's friends tried to warn him, but she convinced him they were just making things up. She even had the audacity to make him apologize to the guy she was cheating with. The night of the bachelorette party, she took all her bridesmaids to her affair partner's house and spent the night with him. He even showed up at the wedding. It was painfully awkward. Everyone was whispering about it. The groom knew, but he chose to look the other way. After the wedding, she insisted on including the other guy in all their vacations and social events. If they had an open relationship, fine, but her husband was not okay with it. He was miserable for years while she kept gaslighting him, making him think his feelings were the problem. She even admitted to my sister that the affair guy never wanted to get married or have kids, so she used her fiancé to get both. They divorced 2 years later, right after their second child was born. She immediately moved in with the affair partner, and the two of them ended up getting married. Weirdly enough, the second child is probably actually his. As for the ex-husband, he eventually married a girl they went to high school with and seems to be doing fine now. Story 24. I always hear stories about wedding day cheating, but one stuck with me. Late one night, I was leaving a venue and heading toward the train station when I spotted the bride down an alley, on her knees, with the best man. I never understood why people do this. Cheating is bad enough, but on your wedding night, why even bother getting married at that point? Story 25. I'm a wedding photographer and I've seen some things. There was one wedding where the bride and groom got into a full-blown argument during dinner, another where a couple started fist-fighting during their first dance, and then there was the night I was leaving a venue and, on my way to the train, I saw the bride in an alley with the best man. That one will always stick with me. I also worked as a photographer for a reality TV wedding. At the end of the night, I was having a drink with the film crew when the groom came up to me and a producer and said, "I think I've made a big mistake." We tried to reassure him, telling him that second-guessing is normal after such a big decision. He shook his head and said, "No, I think I'm gay." The next week, watching the fallout unfold on social media was pure chaos. Oh, and another time, I was working with a videographer who had mic'd up the bride and groom. At one point, he called me over and said, "Listen to this." The groom was talking to a bridesmaid, telling her they had to end their affair now that he was married. Weddings are wild. I've been doing this for over a decade, and I still love every second of it. Story 26. I was at a wedding for a family friend I had never met. At the rehearsal dinner, guests smashed ceramic and porcelain on the ground. And I had just moved to Germany, so this seemed bizarre, but my boyfriend explained that it's a tradition. It symbolizes that life can be messy, and the couple has to work together to clean it up. while the bride kind of half-heartedly motioned for the groom to start sweeping. He picked up a little, then got bored and wandered off to talk to his friends, leaving most of the mess behind. Over the next 3 days of celebrations, I don't think I saw the couple interact once. It was a beautiful wedding, and I was grateful to be invited, but I wasn't surprised when I heard they divorced a few years later. Story 27. At a wedding I attended, the bride and groom mysteriously disappeared for half an hour during the reception. They had both been saving themselves for marriage, and apparently just couldn't wait any longer. Which, is fine. But in the end, it turned out that was more or less the main reason they had rushed into getting married. They made it almost a year. Story 28. My old boss, who was divorced, once told me I should have known it wasn't going to last when the only happy moment on my wedding day was sneaking out to smoke with my buddies in the parking lot. Story 29. The woman who made my wedding cake is a family friend. During our consultation, she had one rule. Before the wedding, we had to agree together on how we would serve each other cake. We could do nothing, serve it nicely, dab a little on the nose, or even smash it, as long as we both agreed beforehand. Her reasoning? She had seen too many marriages start off on the wrong foot over the cake moment. We ended up just cutting the cake together and skipping the feeding part altogether. Story 30. The groom took the whole cake smash thing way too far. The bride had playfully dabbed a little frosting on his chin. In return, he smashed an entire piece into her face so hard that I honestly expected her to get a bloody nose. Frosting went up her nose, into her eyes, and down the front of her dress. She had to leave to clean up and redo her makeup, ugly crying less than an hour after saying, "I do." He didn't care at all. Story 31. I was the best man at a wedding a few years ago. During the rehearsal dinner, the groom's future in-laws treated him like trash. They bossed him around, made him run errands, and talked down to him the entire time. Afterward, they didn't let him hang out with his groomsmen, while the bride went out drinking with her friends. They're divorced now. Lesson learned, you don't just marry a person, you marry their family. And more often than not, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Story 32. My college roommate went on his honeymoon alone. The bride's family had planned and paid for a luxury resort in Jamaica. Only, at the literal boarding gate, she had a full-blown panic attack and refused to get on the plane. Turns out this wasn't new. It had happened before on family trips and sports events, but for some reason they thought this time would be different. Rather than waste a $10,000 vacation, the groom went by himself. He had a great time. His wife wasn't even mad, but for some reason her family was. They lasted nearly 5 years and split on good terms, staying best friends. Story 33. The bride went on her honeymoon alone because she booked a Caribbean vacation despite her husband having a severe sun allergy. To clarify, they were young and had been together for years. It didn't seem strange to them that she would go while he stayed behind. He just wanted her to be happy, and she had always dreamed of traveling abroad. They separated 6 months later. She later admitted that getting married was an attempt to prolong a relationship that had already run its course, kind of like couples who have a baby to save their marriage. They stayed friends after separating, though. And for what it's worth, she was completely loyal while she was away. As for the groom's sun allergy, he had red hair, incredibly fair skin, and could get hospital-worthy sunburns within minutes. He always had to wear sunglasses, long sleeves, and a hat, even on cloudy days. So yeah, a tropical vacation wasn't exactly his thing. Story 34. The groom was in a band, and the whole wedding turned into a promotion for it. He even sang to his bride, except instead of a love song, he just used it as an opportunity to show off his vocal range with some classic piece. Halfway through, the bride tried to join him on stage, and he looked annoyed that she was stealing his limelight. They lasted 2 years. Turns out he had been sleeping with the other vocalist in the band. Story 35. I once attended the wedding of a friend of my husband's. I didn't know the couple well, but I knew enough to be shocked when we arrived at the church and saw the groom already very drunk in the parking lot, and he kept drinking. This was a full Catholic ceremony, with all the kneeling, standing, and long prayers. I still don't know how he made it through, but somehow he did. At the reception, he kept partying while his new wife cried in the bathroom. When it came time for the first dance, he could barely stand, stumbling around despite a full year of dance lessons. And when it was time to remove the garter, instead of a simple toss, he did a full-on striptease, getting down to his underwear in front of his elderly relatives. People were shocked. The whole thing was a disaster. I gave the marriage a year, maybe 2. They've been married for 25 plus years. Story 36. I used to be a wedding singer, and I once performed at a wedding where we genuinely couldn't figure out who the groom was because he was never anywhere near the bride. The first dance was delayed because the wedding planner struggled to get them in the same place at the same time. After that, they stayed on opposite ends of the ballroom for the entire 6-hour reception. I don't think they spoke to each other once. Story 37. The bride and groom did their first dance, and then they spent the rest of the night drinking separately with their own groups of friends. The only dancing that happened after that was the bride dancing with her high school friends, the father-daughter dance, the mother-son dance, during which the groom cried. Then came the best man's speech. He didn't mention the bride at all. His entire toast boiled down to, "Groom, you're married now, but our bond is older and stronger. Our hunting and fishing trips together are the best thing in our lives, and I can't wait for more." The whole thing had this weird, sad, desperate atmosphere. They made it just over a year. Story 38. The most beautiful wedding I've ever been to ended in divorce. The venue was where the groom's father was buried. He actually cried while making his vows to the bride, standing over his dad's grave. Turned out he had been cheating on her for months. They divorced not long after. Something about marrying someone while actively cheating on them, practically over your father's grave, just feels extra slimy. Ironically, this is the only wedding I've ever attended that ended in divorce. Story 39. At my boyfriend's sister's wedding, the groom was already drunk before the vows and smoked right after. By the time the ceremony was over, he was completely cross-faded and making a fool of himself. When we went up to congratulate them, the bride refused to stand near him or take any pictures with him. It was painfully awkward. After the speeches, most of the guests left. The remaining family opened gifts, and someone gave them a nice bottle of champagne. The groom tried to open it, only to drop and shatter it on the floor. The bride lost it, screamed at him, and stormed off. Despite all this, they still went on their honeymoon to Florida, and she got pregnant almost immediately. About 7 months into her pregnancy, she kicked him out for sleeping with her roommate. They were officially divorced by the time their child was 6 months old. Honestly, it was for the best. The guy was selfish, reckless, and wasted a lot of their money just to have a good time on their wedding day. Story 40. The bachelor and bachelorette parties were held in Vegas at the same time in hotel rooms across the hall from each other. On the last night of the trip, the bride and groom got into a huge fight. As I was leaving, I told the groom, "See you at the wedding," and he just sighed and said, "I'm not sure there's going to be one." There was a wedding, but they were divorced within 18 months. Story 41. The groom got so wasted at the reception that he had a fistfight in the bathroom with the bride's cousin, told all of her other cousins to go fucks themselves, hit on my aunt, joked to my cousin's child to come back when you're 15 or 16, forgot to bring his own kid to the hotel. Story 42. The morning after the wedding, the newlywed bride turned to her groom at the campfire and asked, "Are you going to wear your ring every day? Because it kind of makes you look like a fucko." Everyone else just side-eyed each other and took very long sips of coffee. They lasted maybe 6 months. Story 43. My brother's ex-wife gave off so many red flags at their wedding. During the vows, she wasn't even looking at him. She was scanning the room, making sure everyone was watching her. Later, she told the photographer, who was a family friend helping out for cheap, to mingle and get shots of people being happy. 10 minutes later, she yelled at him, "Whose wedding is this? I meant get shots of people being happy for me." They eventually divorced when she cheated on my brother. Turns out she only wanted the marriage while it got her attention. Story 44. For once, here's a happy version of one of these stories. My high school English teacher had a friend who secretly eloped with her boyfriend when they were 16. They took a bus to the next state over, where it was legal, got married in secret, and only told everyone after they graduated. They've now been married for over 40 years. Story 45. I was at a wedding when a phone went off during the vows. It was the groom's, and he answered it. They are now divorced. Apparently, it was his cousin calling to ask if they were late for the wedding. Story 46. At the reception, the bride tried to playfully feed the groom some cake, pulling it back at the last second. She did this twice. The third time, he slapped the cake out of her hand and stormed off. In the stunned silence that followed, we all knew it wouldn't last. Shockingly, they made it almost 2 years before the bride eloped with her stepbrother. No one saw that coming. Story 47. When my sister got married to her first husband, she turned to my dad as they walked down the aisle and mouthed, "I can make this work, right?" They were divorced 6 months later. Our whole family knew it was a bad idea from the moment they got engaged. Story 48. During the vows, the officiant got to the for richer or poorer part. The bride smirked and said, "For richer or richer, and maybe for poorer." The officiant was not pleased. They lasted a year. Story 49. 2 days before her wedding, my friend told me she found her fiancé annoying, didn't even like him, and that he was awful in bed. At the rehearsal dinner, she looked visibly miserable. The morning of the wedding, she sobbed hysterically for hours, so much that she couldn't even get her makeup done. She refused to get dressed and stalled the wedding for 35 minutes. During the ceremony, she recited 45 minutes of vows that were mostly directed at her friends and family, barely mentioning her actual husband. When it came time to say I do, she paused for a full minute before mumbling, yeah, okay, yeah, I do. It was the most painfully awkward wedding I've ever been to. I'm still betting on 10 months max. Story 50. Before our wedding, I asked my husband to practice dancing with me because I have a disability that affects my coordination. He refused, saying we'd be fine. During our first dance, he whispered in my ear, loudly enough for people nearby to hear, "What are you doing? What's wrong with you? You're embarrassing me." We lasted 2 years. Leaving was the best decision I ever made. Story 51. At one wedding, the bride drank vodka out of a pint glass and spent a significant portion of the reception making out with another guy on the dance floor. Story 52. The groom partied too hard the night before the wedding, got completely plastered, and ended up in the emergency room between the ceremony and the reception. During wedding photos, they had to hold a cold pack to his neck just to keep him from passing out. The marriage lasted 30 days before they got into a fight. She left the house. Story 53. I once read about a college professor who developed a system for predicting whether marriages would last. He would have engaged couples discuss difficult topics, things they were likely to argue about. The sessions were videotaped, and research assistants would later analyze them, counting specific behaviors. What he found was that fighting itself wasn't a red flag. Many long-lasting, happy marriages involved a lot of fighting. The key predictor of divorce? Disrespect. Couples who showed contempt for each other, eye-rolling, mocking, dismissiveness, were far more likely to split up. I've kept that in mind ever since. If I ever sense contempt in a relationship, I know it's a massive red flag. And if I ever catch myself treating my partner with disrespect, I know something is deeply wrong. I've been married twice. Both ended in heartbreak, and I still feel a deep sadness that they didn't last. But even after all these years, I still respect both of my ex-wives, and that means something. Story 54. Not about the couple getting married, but the best man and maid of honor who were married to each other. During his speech, the best man said, "I've been married for a year, and it feels like 100. The maid of honor stood up, raised her glass, and simply said, "Ditto." The whole room died. It was so awkward. Then, the bride's brother, who had been in a long-term relationship for decades but couldn't legally marry, stood up and gave an impromptu speech about the meaning of partnership and the beauty of sharing life with someone. He talked about how grateful his family was to welcome the groom. It was a beautiful speech, and honestly, I think it may have helped the newlyweds appreciate what they had. I'm watching a disaster unfold in real time. My wife's brother got married this past May. The bride's mother is a big DIY person and completely overdid it, adding extra flowers, table pieces, and decorations on top of what the venue had already provided. Fast forward a few weeks. She sends my mother-in-law an email with receipts. $7,000 worth of extra decorations. She demanded my MIL pay half since the decorations were set up in time for the rehearsal dinner. Now, the newlyweds are fighting because the bride is taking her mother's side. It's getting ugly. Story 56. My wedding. 3 days before, my bridesmaid of honor called to say she couldn't afford the dress she had promised to buy. We had to hand the couple that got married that day is still together 30 plus years later. The best man and maid of honor were divorced within the year. Story 55. DSO won overnight. On the day of the wedding, the bride's mother was supposed to pick up the cake from Austin and drive it an hour south. She left 30 minutes before the wedding. When she finally arrived, an hour late, the cake was destroyed. She had put it in the back seat and sped down the highway, slamming it into the box with every turn. While waiting for the cake, a fist fight nearly broke out between two groomsmen. Why? Because the maid of honor showed up wearing the dress she couldn't afford, a blatant attempt to upstage the bride. Then, during her speech, she started with, "When we first met, I did not like it all, but over time, he grew on me, like a fungus." My entire family froze. Since all these disasters were caused by her friends and family, I was told to suck it up and discuss it later. I assumed she would cut those people off. Nope. 2 years later, when I landed my first well-paying job an hour and a half away, she refused to move with me, choosing to stay in Austin with her friends. I mailed her the divorce papers. She didn't even bother showing up to the hearing. I've never seen her again. Story 57. 2 weddings, both disasters. A good friend of mine got married. I had never met the bride because she's just shy. On the wedding day, she was blackout drunk before the ceremony even started. She couldn't get through her vows, literally couldn't repeat the words. She ended up slapping the groom, spilling champagne all over her dress, crying under a table while the groom tried to comfort her. They lasted 4 months. My wife's friend, a conservative white woman, married a black man. Her racist family refused to attend. In response, she turned the entire wedding into a bizarre racial theme. Vanilla cake for her, chocolate cake for him, black and white decorations, white meat for her guests, dark meat for his. It was incredibly uncomfortable for everyone there. They lasted 2 years, though they divorced because he turned out to be abusive, not because of the weird wedding choices. Story 58. This one was mine. My ex-wife had a flair for theatrics and wanted a choreographed dance for our first dance. Something big, involving the entire wedding party. No one else was interested, but I agreed to take dance lessons with her so she could have her dream wedding. I had never danced before, not even in a club, but I was willing to learn. I struggled, but I managed to get through a few slow dance lessons. Nothing fancy, just enough to shuffle around. Unfortunately, the dance school wouldn't choreograph anything for us, so she gave up on the whole idea. Then came the song selection. She chose I Want You To by Weezer, my favorite band. The song had just been released and had a fun, upbeat feel, but it wasn't exactly made for slow dancing. I suggested we pick something else, but she insisted we could slow dance to it. I made her promise not to change her mind at the last minute. Of course, 30 seconds into the dance, she backed away and started doing a jig in front of everyone. I just stood there, stunned and fuming, while she kept shouting and motioning for me to join in. To make matters worse, we had set a budget for the wedding, which she completely ignored. Her parents later chipped in $5,000, but instead of using it to cover the extra costs, she spent even more. Her parents never actually gave us the money, though. They had a condition that we had to attend a Christian financial planning course run by their friend. My ex, an atheist, had no intention of going but spent the money anyway, knowing we didn't actually have it. Looking back, the warning signs were all there. She didn't respect me at all. She cheated less than a year later and ran off with another guy. Then, before our divorce was even finalized, she went ahead and had another wedding. Story 59. My ex got married a couple of years ago to a woman from a very conservative, religious family. We had stayed friends, and I was surprised when he asked me to be a groomsman. Still, I figured it was a sign of maturity and closure. At his bachelor party, he got really drunk and, out of nowhere, asked me if I had any regrets about us breaking up. I told him that I had loved him, but no, we made the right decision. Then he admitted that sometimes he wished we were the ones getting married, that his fiance's family would never truly accept him. After a pause, he blurted out, "What if we just ran away together?" I laughed it off as a joke and suggested we rejoin the group. But then he said it again later, and again later in the night. It turned out he had asked the same thing to another one of his exes, someone who wasn't a groomsman but was attending the wedding. The couple is still technically married, but they've since separated. Story 60, a photographer I know was hired to shoot a wedding on the Gold Coast, Australia. If you're familiar with the area, you know that while it's a beautiful place, it has a reputation for being a bit like Miami, just without the celebrities and a lot trashier. The bride, groom, and their wedding parties were all getting ready in the same room, and my friend was trying to capture some nice shots. The problem? The groom and his groomsmen were still recovering from their wild bachelor party the night before. Hungover and exhausted, they were also openly making it nearly impossible for my photographer friend to get any decent pictures. As the tension in the room grew, the bride finally asked them to tone it down so they could take a few proper photos. Instead of listening, the groom snapped, yelling, "Shut up!" before continuing as if nothing happened. The person who got my friend the job later told her the couple divorced just 4 months after the wedding. Another friend of mine ended up in a marriage that was doomed from the start. He had been with his girlfriend for 8 years when she gave him an ultimatum: either propose within the year or she was leaving. Feeling pressured, he proposed, and they went through with the wedding. However, in every single wedding photo she posted online, neither of them looked happy. They ended up divorcing less than a year later. Story 61. Not at the wedding itself, but when my spouse and I went to pick up our marriage license, we witnessed a young man yelling at his fiancée outside the building. He was furious because she had failed to remind him to bring the correct IDs. We just looked at each other like, yeah, that's not a great start. I hope they're doing okay. Story 62. The bride was about 3 months away from giving birth when they got married. A few people at the wedding already knew there was a strong chance the baby wouldn't share the groom's ethnicity. When the baby was born, their suspicions were confirmed, but instead of walking away, the groom chose to raise the child as his own. Despite everything, they're still happily married. Story 63. This wasn't at the wedding, but it was the first time I really got to talk to the couple. About a year after they got married, they visited our city, and my wife, who's the groom's cousin, and I met them for drinks. One of the first topics they brought up, the lifestyle scene, as in swinging. Later that night, I mentioned to my wife that the bride seemed to be openly flirting with her. My wife brushed it off, saying I'm not great at reading those signals. A while later, we met up again at a family funeral. After the service, We were all hanging out in a hotel room, drinking. The bride started flirting with my wife again, only this time she was being very obvious about it. She even went out of her way to demonstrate her skills at tying intricate bedroom knots. Meanwhile, the groom was sitting in the same room. I brought it up to my wife again, and this time she admitted she had noticed it too. Not long after, the couple divorced. It turned out the bride had only come to terms with or accepted that she was into women after she was already married. Story 64. During the cake cutting ceremony, the bride aggressively shoved a piece of cake into the groom's face. It wasn't playful or in good humor. There was real anger behind it. You could tell by his reaction that he was not happy. They divorced a year later,